I actually organized a workshop on this topic called can psychology improve policing? Because I had read a lot of the psychological literature about that, but it came to think, and in fact, in the conference we all came to think that you were there. Of course, you were there. Okay, sorry, I recognized you from someplace. Okay, so you can tell me what you took it, but I took the upshot of that to be psychology. It's not really exactly the place to look to improve policing. I gave you these examples because I think they do. The individual bias is a real thing, and it's in an individual, so it's important, to that extent.
We're so pleased to host her here at Harvard Bookstore today, discussing her new book, The Rationality of Perception. Please join me in welcoming Susanna Siegel.
So this book is a book of philosophy, and it centers around a problem that concerns what a person can learn from their perception when their perception is influenced by what they fear or want or by other expectations they have. There's a lot of evidence from psychology that expectations do influence perception. In color perception, the color of a gray banana will look more yellow than a gray non-banana. In social perception, you can show people a big string of faces all at once, and at one end, the face is clearly happy, and at the other end, the face is clearly angry. And in between, as each face changes, it changes only very gradually. And you can ask people to identify the place where the faces change from being happy to being angry. Children who have been physically abused will locate the shift to anger at a point much closer to the happy endpoint than the angry endpoint, compared with children who haven't been physically abused. And in recent years, there's been a big outgrowth of experiments probing the impact of racialized attitudes on perception. A mild human collision where one person pushes another will be seen as either aggressive or playful, depending on the perceived race of the person doing the pushing. A face in a picture is matched for color to a lighter or a darker patch, depending only on how that one face is labeled, black or white. A boy in a photograph who's said to be accused of a felony will be estimated to be older if he is perceived as black compared to if he's perceived as white or Latino. These are all effects of expectations on perception in some way. But how should we interpret these experiments? There's an important distinction between the visual appearances, which are a kind of perceptual experience on the one hand, and the beliefs or judgments that you can form, a person will form in response to those perceptual experiences. For example, if I put this pencil into a glass of water, it will, from some angles, look bent, but you won't believe it's bent because you know it can't change its shape just from being dunked in the water. So that shows that there's a difference between perceptual experiences and beliefs you form in response to them. We don't always believe our eyes. And that same difference is one we can appreciate even in cases where we do believe our eyes. Like if you were looking for your brother in the kitchen and you walk into the kitchen and there's nobody there, you believe your eyes, but you'd also form a new belief that your brother is not in the kitchen. So here too, we can distinguish between perceptual experiences and the judgments or beliefs that we make in response to them. So with the experiments that I mentioned, they show that there is an impact of expectations on perception, but they leave open whether that impact is on judgment or all the way, whether the impact reaches all the way to the visual experiences themselves. So for example, does that gray banana really look more yellow than the gray non-banana, or is it just that you judge it to be more yellow? Does that person doing the pushing really look aggressive, or is the judgment that they're aggressive just a judgment you're forming in response to how they look? Now, when the impact of expectations reaches all the way down to perceptual experiences, then a philosophical problem arises. And I wrote this book because I was gripped by that problem. Here's the problem. Jack and Jill, they have a complicated relationship. And Jill is worried that Jack's angry with her. And when she sees him, her fearful suspicion that he's angry affects the way he looks to her. It affects her visual experiences that she has when he sees him. If you saw Jack, he just looked like he has a neutral expression, which is what he really has. But when she sees him, her fearful expectation that he's angry affects her visual experiences. And the question that gripped me was, does Jill's visual experience in this situation give her reason to believe her eyes? Does it give her reason to believe that Jack is angry? Now, on the one hand, if Jack really looks angry to Jill, then when she sees him, she doesn't have any other indication that her experience has been influenced by her fear. So what else could she reasonably believe about his emotional state other than that he's angry? From her point of view, she's in one of these utterly ordinary circumstances in which it's reasonable to believe your eyes. We've all been in hundreds of these circumstances all day long. If you wanted to find the door to the bookstore, you would look and you'd see it, and then you know where the door is, and you know how to get inside. So of course it was reasonable for you to believe your eyes in that situation. And from Jill's point of view, when she sees Jack, she's in just that type of situation. So that speaks for answering yes. She should believe that he's angry, because that's how he looks. On the other hand, it also seems like what's happening is that Jill is having an unfounded fear that's leading to an experience. And if it was wrong for her to base her belief that Jack's angry on an unfounded fear, why does it suddenly become okay to base her belief that he's angry on an experience that was brought about by that same unfounded fear? So that's the philosophical problem. It's that we have a simple yes-no question, but it doesn't have a simple answer. And I call that problem the problem of hijacked experiences to capture the idea that in these cases, perceptual experience is hijacked by fear in being overly influenced by it, overly influenced by a factor that intuitively shouldn't be steering it. Now, since this problem takes the form of a difficulty in answering a yes-no question, one form a solution could take is to argue that one of those answers is the correct one to give. My solution is that the correct answer is no. It's not reasonable for Jill to believe her eyes. And the answer can be no, according to my solution, because perceptual experiences can actually be formed irrationally or rationally in response to the expectations you bring to the situation, even if you have no idea that your perceptions came about in response to those expectations, even if you have no idea that you have, in effect, reasoned your way to a perceptual experience from those expectations. So believing that somebody's happy just because you want them to be happy, that's called wishful thinking. Believing that somebody is dangerous or threatening just because you're afraid that they are, that's called fearful thinking. My solution is that Jill's situation is just like fearful thinking, except it's fearful seeing, and it's just as bad. Now, of course, that's not the only solution to the problem. There are many possible solutions to the problem. You can say no, as I do, but give a different backstory about why no is the right answer to the question of whether it's reasonable for Jill to believe her eyes. Or you can say yes and try to do something to address the sense that maybe yes isn't the right answer. Or you can be very sophisticated and say both yes and no, yes in some ways and no in others, and draw some further distinctions. So like many philosophical problems, this one has many possible solutions. And as a philosophical inquiry, the ultimate goal is to understand the structure of the inquiry itself. And one way to understand a problem is to understand its potential solutions and each of the advantages and drawbacks and consequences and pitfalls of those solutions. Now, my solution, it has a lot of explaining to do, because we're used to thinking of perceptual experiences as things that you might be able to rationally or irrationally respond to, but not as things that manifest rationality or irrationality themselves. In fact, perception, almost by definition, seems to be pretty different from reasoning. You reason from information you have already, whereas perception is kind of a way of taking in current information about what's in your immediate surroundings. So in that way, they seem quite different. Moreover, our paradigms of reasoning are things like assessing whether it would be better to leave today or better to leave tomorrow. Say we can't figure it out yet. Better to leave today or better to leave tomorrow. And if I think this matter through, I can explain to you how I reach my conclusion by saying things like, it'd be better to leave tomorrow because the traffic will be lighter. But when you reach a conclusion through that kind of reasoning, the conclusion's never a perceptual experience. You don't, and in fact we can't explicitly, through deliberation, reason our way to perceptual experiences. So how could those experiences possibly be conclusions of reasoning? Well, I feel the force of these considerations, which of course are considerations against the solution I argue for. But I want to tell you a bit about why I think the right answer is no to the problem of hijacked experience. And I want to highlight one of the consequences of my solution for a very different domain, which is the domain of applying reasonable person standards in the law. Now, the problem of hijacked perception has a social dimension to it. So we all know that feeling of being summed up at a glance, for better or for worse. And when that happens, it's as if some possibilities of human interaction are foregrounded in the social space between us, and other possibilities of human interaction are backgrounded in that social space. And still other possibilities are completely off the radar. If, for example, you are seen and summed up at a glance as dangerous, then from the perceiver's point of view, the possibility of some civil or unremarkable, even friendly interactions is backgrounded. And the possibility that you, the perceived person, might do something disruptive or awful is looming. Now, the social versions of the problem of hijacked perception, they're especially vivid and really extreme when perception leads quickly to violence and even to death. And when I began to think about cases like that, I found my intellectual register shifting from the kind of reflection on perception that I think can be done fruitfully while abstracting from what happens at particular places and times, to a different kind of thinking that focuses on culturally very highly specific phenomena. I found myself switching back and forth between these two registers in a way that I found I had to in order to address the questions I was asking. I found myself in particular focused on cases like the ones that the Black Lives Matter movement brought to the front of political discussion. There was, for example, the cases you've all heard about, thanks to the movement publicizing them. There was the shooting and the killing of the 12-year-old boy, Tamir Rice, in Cleveland, where the officers decided to shoot within just a few minutes of perceiving him. They were told he had a gun, and they shot him, and they killed him, and they described him as being about 20 years old. There was another case that you have all heard about, again, thanks to the fact that it was made into a political issue, of the killing of the 18-year-old Michael Brown by the officer Darren Wilson, who, when he testified to the grand jury about how Michael Brown's face looked to him while they were physically struggling, he described it by saying that Wilson had the most intense aggressive face. That's the only way I can describe it. It looks like a demon. That's how angry he looked. Now, we don't know exactly what perceptual experiences these particular officers have had. We don't know what experiences they had in those situations, just as we don't know whether in the psychological experiments I described earlier, the effects are effects on perceptual experience or on judgments. So none of these cases, either the experiments or these things that actually happened, none of them necessarily give us instances of the problem of hijacked perception. That problem is really specific to influences on perceptual experience. But to think through the possible solutions to a philosophical problem, we don't need actual cases of influences on experience. You can use hypothetical versions of actual cases, where we just assume for the sake of argument that racialized expectations can give rise to perceptual experiences in which young people appear threatening and dangerous to perceivers. And then we can ask our same question, like the one we asked about Jill. If perceptual experiences, in these cases, are manifestations of a racialized attitude that black men and boys are dangerous, is it reasonable for people having those experiences to believe their eyes? Now we know, because the case is set up to be just like Jill, that it will seem reasonable to them. It will seem as reasonable as it is to conclude that there's mustard in the fridge when you open the fridge and you see the mustard. Okay? But I think that these social cases make clearer and clearer than the Jack and Jill case makes. It makes clear the consequences of letting your solution to this problem be guided by how things seem to the perceiver. So the idea that perceptual experiences can come about irrationally, that helps us see why we don't have to be guided in that way. Now, you probably know that police officers are legally allowed to use force based on perceptions of threat, so long as their perception is deemed reasonable. And it's prosecutors, judges, and juries and grand juries that are allowed to determine what's reasonable. Now, it's hard to see how you could have a police force at all without leeway for using force, and it's hard to see how you could have a decent policy about that leeway without something like a reasonable person standard. The difficulties, when they come in applying the standard and in interpreting it. Now, you probably also know that the officers who shot and killed the people I've mentioned weren't convicted, and that their actions were deemed reasonable. And if their actions are reasonable, that could only be because their beliefs about the threats that they faced were deemed reasonable as well. And the verdict that those actions, and therefore that those beliefs, were reasonable mobilized thousands of people who felt that the officers couldn't possibly have been giving reasonable responses to the situation because their estimations of the threat and danger that was posed to them was so far off the mark. Now, this kind of situation leads us to ask exactly how you're supposed to apply these reasonable person standards. And when juries, judges, prosecutors are determining whether a defendant's perception of threat is reasonable, what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to consider what a reasonable person in the defendant's circumstances would believe about whether they face some imminent severe threat, and if so, how imminent, how severe that threat is. They're supposed to ask what would be reasonable to believe about those things in those circumstances. Now, on the prevailing view, both in philosophy and in law, what it's reasonable for people to believe depends in part on how it's reasonable to respond to the way things look to them. In this case, the way other people look to them. How one comes to have the perceptual experiences, that's not supposed to matter. If someone looked dangerous to you on this view, it'd be reasonable for you to believe that they are dangerous on this view, just full stop. That's all you have to know. And if you look dangerous to someone else, you should excuse them if they become agitated upon seeing you, because it's reasonable to be agitated in response to danger. Well, the rationality of perception view gives us a different way to think about applying reasonable person standards. Because on the rationality of perception view, when you assess the reasonableness of a belief, that reasonableness doesn't just depend on how you respond to the perceptions you have. It can also depend on which perceptions, which perceptual experiences you have in the first place. For instance, the danger experience could, on this view, it could in principle be inferred from unreasonable expectations built into racial prejudice. And if that was the case, then it would be an experience that isn't reasonable to have. So this way, on that view, when you assess what a reasonable person in similar circumstances would believe, you don't have to hold constant the experiences that the original person had. A reasonable person in similar circumstances, it's open to say, wouldn't have had those experiences to begin with. They wouldn't have had an unreasonable prejudice, and therefore they wouldn't have inferred an experience from that prejudice because they wouldn't have had it at all. I think this solution to the problem of hijacked experience, it speaks to the social dimensions of the problem. Now, when we treat philosophical problems, we are trying to find solutions. We're not just wallowing in the problems, but we don't expect the solutions to be decisive. It's just that our overall goal is to illuminate the structure of inquiry in an area. We don't expect everyone to agree about what the right solution is necessarily, but we do aim to have a better understanding of the possible solutions. And that understanding comes from appreciating the consequences and the commitments that different solutions make. In the case of my solution to the problem, one of the consequences that it puts on the table is another way of applying reasonable person standards. Most of the consequences and commitments become visible only at a level of inquiry that's quite different from the level of inquiry we find when we think through the cases from real life that I mentioned. So most of the consequences and the commitments of my solution become visible only when we consider in very general terms that actually abstracts away from historically specific places and times how perception could possibly redound well or badly on something, and how to unpack this crucial notion of rationality that's in the title. And how you could, without being aware of it, reason your way to a perceptual experience, and what role in our mental lives perceptual experiences would then play. So that's the bulk of what this book does. That's it. So please ask me anything. Yeah.
I'd say in terms of the racial issue, if you live in a big city, and like New York or Boston, Chicago, and you see certain individuals of a certain color committing crimes, maybe against you or maybe not, or maybe you see a lot of it on the news, whatever, I would say that according to what you just stated, that individual has been prejudiced. If you grew up in a different society where you see people of the same color doing wonderful things and living, a very good and full life, and doing positive acts and being rewarded for those acts on the media, then you will act accordingly, and you will have a positive view when you see what you think is someone who resembles someone you've seen in the past. So really, that's the thing. It's a conditioning. Is that?
The core of your question is focused on whether kinds of prejudice that I mentioned in one of my examples is really unreasonable. And I am focused on primarily on the idea that if your experience was inferred from an unreasonable expectation, then your experience could be unreasonable. That's the philosophical core of what I'm saying. Now, I encountered many versions of your question in the course of talking this over with people, and many of them are addressed in chapter 10. Because another interesting issue that your question raises is, what's the relationship between some individual's assumption that they might just grow into, just absorb unreflectively from their culture, and the assumption that's built into the culture itself? You might think, well, if they were unaware of just absorbing this ideology, then, can't blame them. But if you think about it, that's exactly Jill's situation. If you were going to say you wouldn't blame them for that, then why don't you say that Jill should just go ahead and believe her eyes? So perhaps this is a sophisticated way of you wanting to answer yes to the question. Whereas I was thinking that if you look at how certain kinds of prejudice, or it doesn't even have to be prejudice, it could be any kind of culturally entrenched assumption, comes to be culturally entrenched, you can see reasonable and unreasonable versions of that. For example, the idea that water is safe to drink. Okay, that's culturally entrenched presumption. You see people drinking the water from the tap and so on. They don't take precautions not to. So why shouldn't you believe that the water is safe to drink? That could be a case of reasonableness. But if you look at these types of prejudice that have influenced greatly how the reasonable person's standards in the law are actually applied, and look at how those culturally entrenched presumptions come to be in the culture, it doesn't look at all like that. It doesn't look at all like some reasonable assumption. It looks like some sort of rationalization of social inequalities. So I think the issue's fascinatingly complicated because it lets us ask about the epistemic status of both culturally entrenched presumptions and individual beliefs. And that's the topic of chapter 10.
Yeah. I'm kind of interested in how, you say that, and how you call this a, philosophical view or a philosophical problem, and I'm wondering about the psychological component, and in that, I heard you use the terms, perception, reasoning, and judgment, and how all of those things overlap and are intertwined with one another, and to me that often manifests itself in our thought processes, whether we are reacting to somebody we see on the street, or whether we're reacting to a perceived threat, that the same neural pathways are in play.
Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That and that I'm not saying this to justify the behavior of the policemen, but that we are evolutionarily hardwired to fear perceived threats.
Mm-hmm.
And we can develop over time, whether they're culturally influenced or influenced from our life experiences, whether we've experienced trauma or something, to develop various neural pathways that reinforce those perceptions and beliefs.
Yeah.
So you were talking a lot about this is kind of my philosophical solution. I'm sort of wondering about, well, what would be the steps that one or society could realistically take to help such to help such individuals.
Yeah. I agree with a sentiment I think I heard in your question, that when we just focus on a person's neural pathways, it seems like we're not really asking about something that can be, more or less reasonable, because it's just a neural pathway. But I think when we talk about people's fears, we often do classify them as more or less reasonable. If you're afraid of going to the dentist, maybe it's reasonable because you're going to a bad dentist, but it might not be reasonable. It will depend on the situation and depend on how you got the fear. So I think we're on pretty firm ground, and saying that we can at least assess fears as being, founded, well-founded, or ill-founded, by which I mean reasonable or unreasonable. So the fact that neural pathways is involved, in a way, is neither here nor there. We can still ask how reasonable are these fears to have. In your question, just to tie it back to something said earlier, there is the idea in the prejudice case that somehow the prejudices are developed, as it were, empirically through a series of exposures. And I mentioned some reasons to think that that's not really the right way to think about it. That isn't actually the way people come to have at least this kind of prejudice. And the way you can tell that is that in developmental psychology, there's research that shows that even people who are very young, who are embedded in the cultural situations you would expect, have them. So don't think it's actually reconstructible as a kind of learning from what you see. It's more like receiving some testimony. And if you receive testimony from a source that's not a reasonable source, well then maybe the testimony is not reasonable to accept. There was something else in your question I wanted to respond to about, but it might come back to me. I've now forgotten it because I didn't write it down.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not talking about neural pathways as the one and only way of looking at it.
Oh, you asked how could
Talking
people
about
change
this
their minds. You asked
as
how.
a component
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the steps towards
Yeah,
change.
changing, right. Okay, so how do you change people's minds? Well, I don't know how you change their minds, but
No,
but one way you could, but certainly a first step would be to acknowledge attitudes as contingent instead of just things you're forced into because your brain works in one way or the other. So that's my small contribution to
Well,
that.
yeah,
Are you saying that perception, making judgments based on perception is unreasonable always when it's based on psychological precursors? Or is it only in cases where the psychological precursor is unreasonable that the making judgment becomes unreasonable?
The latter.
Or when the precursor is unreasonable?
Yeah, that's the simplified version. But it's not the case that any old influence of a psychological precursor on your experience could make the experience unreasonable or make subsequent beliefs based on it unreasonable. And you can see that by looking at cases of expert seeing where your experiences are informed by your expertise. Some people think that moral perception works this way, that your ability to see that there's something wrong in a situation, if you're really seeing it, it could only come from some background of moral dispositions or insights. And yeah, so those would be potential examples of good influences on your experience. Yeah. Yeah, please.
A long time ago, William Kingdon Clifford wrote The Ethics of Belief,
Yeah.
arguing that people have no right to believe, they have beliefs that were not based upon a thorough examination of evidence. And William James wrote that rules of belief in response to that. Would you go so far as to say that there's such a thing as an ethics of perception? Kingdon talked about ethics of belief.
In a sense, it might not be exactly analogous to the ethics of belief, but there's certainly dispositions you can have to be susceptible, as in the moral case I just mentioned, to things that you should have seen. If there's such a thing as being obtuse. Obtuseness in people is when they don't perceive things, pick up on things that they ought to. So yes, I think there is, in a sense, an ethics of perception. Yeah.
Another question that comes to mind too, when it comes to dispositional bias and perceptions.
Yeah.
How do you legislate which one is correct? I'm just thinking, this is something I read this morning, a case in Paris recently where police was summoned to a residence and a Chinese answered opened the door and he had a pair of scissors in his hand and they shot him. And of course, I suppose the perception for the police was that he looked like he was brandishing a weapon. And his family explained he was preparing fish at the time. And of course, when you're summoned to a police officer is summoned to a location, he has one perception. And of course, with other ethnic, cultural nuances, dictate otherwise. We legislate which is the correct.
So there's a whole world of complexity in the relationship between what you believe and what you do. And, the problems and cases you're discussing or the problems in policing here, many of them concern that relationship, not what you initially believe, but given what you believe, what you do. So I'm interested in just the belief part. Of course, it has consequences. If your belief isn't reasonable, then your actions can't be. But your beliefs might be reasonable, but the actions might be disproportionate. So, a common way to not get off on a self-defense is if your actions were too extreme in relation to the threat that you reasonably perceived. So that's sort of a separate set of issues. But how do you decide? If you're asking, how do you decide how it's reasonable to respond? Well, people do have a sense of what's. People do decide that. Perhaps they decide it in some ways that are integrate other prejudices they have. That's sort of to be expected. But how do we decide what's a reasonable belief? Well, this is something I think we don't have to question whether there's such a thing as a reasonable belief just because there are cases where it's hard to determine exactly what would be reasonable belief. But I think we can get pretty far with some of our examples. The challenging ones are the ones where, from your point of view, all of the evidence seems to speak in favor of the belief, and yet still something pulls against the thought that it is reasonable. And that's the problem of hijacked perception.
What about the issue, say, how Muslims dress? We have many more Muslims living among us in the West altogether. And there's a lot of prejudice about women who cover themselves up, and that that they themselves are fearful, or they are being oppressed by the men. I mean, there are these bigger cultural questions. And, if you live in a Muslim country, well, then that's just sort of the way it is. But if you see these people as strangers and maybe as threats, I don't have a solution to it, but that's a big perceptual question. And then if fear is promoted by politicians or whatever, then it gets something you maybe didn't care about, something when you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Yeah. And that's not the difference of what you see, but what you have been told you should understand.
Yeah. My point is that perception isn't insulated from what you've been seen or told, and so whatever difficulties we have that you're bringing out with what people might fear or believe, we'll also have at the level of perception.
Change gears a bit. So who did the artwork?
That would be my mother.
It's outstanding. And is there any correlation between the wind turbine and
Yes.
the content?
Yes, so Don Quixote famously had a whole sequence of illusions where he saw windmills as giants, and then he reacted, and you could see from the outside how absurd it was, and of course it makes a great quasi-Picaresque novel. Well, I thought that the wind turbine was a 21st century opportunity for Don Quixote, so that's why I asked my mother to draw me a wind turbine, and she made a really beautiful purple sky.
There's a term bandied around a lot called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive to me is the same as perception, what comes in through my senses. Dissonance is if it doesn't jive with my belief.
Yes.
Then I sit and have a fit or
Right.
crazy.
I do something. That was the theory that said I'll always do something in response to my dissonance, because the dissonance is a feeling of discomfort that makes me adjust my beliefs, or if you tell me something and it causes me dissonance, I'll probably say, get mad at you or something.
And that term is used in management and everywhere.
Yep.
Is it too generic a word, or have you opened it up a lot more sensibly, or I see it bandied around a lot?
Is there a specific way you see dissonance as entering into the perceptual problems?
In management thinking, they seem to use it a lot. That's where I learned it.
I suppose that there are, you could see the discomfort or the comfort that one might feel upon perceiving someone when you take them in at a glance and form, assumptions so quickly. You could see that as a locus of dissonance, or the absence of dissonance. So you could see some people sort of, they go down easy, and other people sort of embrace it right from the start, even before there's hardly any interaction at all. So I suppose you could see dissonance in the relationship between perception and belief, not as a special case perhaps of dissonance in the relationship between incoming evidence and belief. I guess
It's like
that's how I see it.
I think you explained the next answer of the question is you're not dealing with action. Back in Mumbai, when there was a terrorist attack on the Taj, 140 employees, not one left their positions. They were dealing with action. Here, you're dealing with action. 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 You're dealing with action And,
Mm.
you know, heroes are not collective.
Mhm.
When psychiatrists explained it, they said, we don't understand when a gun is pointed at you, you run. Now, 140 people didn't run, so
I see.
professors at HBS took it up, and
Uh-huh.
ultimately they drew some conclusions to take them forward.
Uh-huh.
And then they said, well, these were from rural areas where you still
Yeah.
believe in loyalty, et cetera, et cetera. You buying that?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know, but I mean, as a psychological explanation, if you want to see why does somebody, you know, why don't you leave the building when there's a fire alarm? And you think, oh, it's not really annoying enough to be a real fire alarm. Or a car alarm is completely useless because you hear it and you think there's a car alarm. So it doesn't cause the kind of discomfort that, you know, should motivate you. That makes for an inefficacious alarm. A good alarm would cause some kind of discomfort. Not quite sure if you want to call it exactly cognitive dissonance, but
Started talking about Jack and Jill kind of as a joke, said they had a complicated relationship. But the way that Jill knows Jack seems like it would really matter. Like if Jill really knows Jack very well, then Jack might not look angry to me.
right,
Understandably
Yeah.
and correctly.
yeah,
She might be picking up on something. Or if
Yeah.
Jill is one of those kids who had experienced abuse and so would have picked out,
mm-hmm.
done the line of the faces at the other point, she might be more skittish
Mm-hmm.
about the world,
yeah,
but sometimes she'll be right. She'll be
Right.
more right than
That's
I
right.
will be, you know,
Yep.
so.
it's safer to be what they call having a low criterion for anger if the stakes are high. So that's presumably what's happening with the physically abused children, is that they're going to count more faces as angry because for them there's very bad consequences from being angry. So they don't want to miss any. They don't want to have any false negatives. They'd rather have false positives. That's a way of reconstructing what's going on for them. In the Jill case, there are no doubt versions of the Jill case or versions of relationships, let's hope there are anyway, where you have a kind of expert's perception, as came up in your example, where you have people whose acuity is higher for understanding the emotion of the person that they know very well. It doesn't matter too much whether, in this Jack and Jill case, the one that poses the problem of hijack perception, it doesn't matter too much whether she's an expert or isn't. What matters is the idea that her fear is unfounded and that it's responsible for her experience, rather than she might have higher acuity, but it's not kicking in on that instant.
Oh, but unfounded gets so complicated in a real relationship with people about
Yeah.
about a question such as anger. In other words, she
Yeah.
might have an unfounded fear that there will be a violent act,
I see.
But-
yeah.
but it might be very common with people you know well to somebody
Yeah.
might deny the fact that
Yeah.
they are uncomfortable or
Yeah.
something like that, but you still
Yeah,
you
you-
might be right. You
you-
might
mhm.
you might be right like 2/3 of the time.
Yeah.
Or something.
Yeah. There could be degrees of hijacking. So Jill's suspicion that he's angry might make him look angry initially when she sees him, but then her acuity or experience or her own caution might kick in, and she might look for more evidence or look more closely or second guess herself or check again and do any of these number of things. And if that happened, we'd now have entered a realm of interesting gossip or perhaps insight or psychology, but we would have left the realm of the problem of hijack experience, because the problem of hijack experience starts when the experience that you are responding to informing your belief is one that has been hijacked by your fear. So in my case, Jill is very readily forming beliefs in response to her experience, or anyway the questions are about the beliefs that the status of the beliefs that she would form if she responded to the experience in which she looked angry, rather than waiting to see. Yeah.
But maybe the problem is the type of example is a little difficult for you because certain things that like fear, the emotions are very complex. Like if you had a
Yeah.
Freudian view, for example, and you thought there was often a lot of hostility or aggression that's kind of sub rosa,
Yeah.
and somebody is, any experience of anger, maybe that person's acuity for that part of
Uh-huh.
if emotions are very mixed
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
from the get-go,
Mhm.
you've got a little bit of a problem in being able to make out this is clearly hijacked.
Yeah,
Not
well,
hijacked.
the
So,
emotions
I mean,
could be
it's-
the emotions could be mixed, but the experience might reflect just one part of the mixture, and I think that would still give rise to the problem. She might be afraid that he's angry. Maybe part of her wants him to be angry because then they'll really have it out and get it clear or something. So that's all right too. Really, the problem's really localized in the status of the beliefs that you would form in response to the experiences that are shaped in that way. Because what you would like to have happen, what would be healthy to happen, what would be perceptually proper in some sense to happen, is if you really could see the way the world works. So if she really could check whether he's angry by seeing, and if you lose that, you lose something like you lose perception. Why bother perceiving? You might as well just go along with what you're. So when people say, well, you should listen, you should look, or you should just be quiet and patient, and some of those things are to make room for unhijacked perception. So perhaps that's, at least in these sort of interpersonal cases, one thing you could do. The social cases, of course, much more complex, and I actually don't think they have a solution at the level of an individual mind at all.
So, in the case when the perception is based on a founded kind of psychological precursor, then is it always reasonable to make a judgment based on that perception?
Well, it could depend on what else is around. So here, an example might be if you have reasonable expectations that bananas are yellow, for example, then and your expectation helps to generate a yellowish experience. But then somebody's told you, actually, the bananas around here are red. So now you have your belief, you have your experience, but you have this other player in the picture as well. So that might complicate the epistemic situation somewhat. And so I don't think we could answer your question of is it always reasonable to believe your eyes if your experience is generated by one of these reasonable expectations. That always reasonable to do that. It'd be a bit too quick to say yes because we haven't specified what else is in the picture. But if nothing else relevant is in the picture, then yeah.
Is it possible for an individual to verify the unreasonableness of your perceptions?
Of their own perceptions.
Yeah.
Perhaps after, if you had good reason to think that your perceptions were generated by your fear and you, on reflection, thought that the fear was unfounded, then sure. In the moment, of course, the cases that give rise to the problem don't have that structure. But if you're asking whether there could be other situations, then sure. Yeah.
So only through experience and through self-reflection, I suppose.
How would you do it? It gets back to your question. How would you come to know that? If you think, well, this is a situation I might fall into, so and I'd like not to be in this situation. So now what can I do to monitor myself so I'm not in the situation? Well, I don't know. Good luck with that. Hopefully there's something to be, but there's probably no general advice that one could take about that. Probably because it's too abstract. You see, this level of abstraction is very useful, and in fact, it's indispensable for some kinds of things. And then it's very obfuscating and unuseful for other kinds of things. So these practical questions of how should we actually be? What kind of cognitive disposition should we cultivate? How can I make sure I'm not in the situation? What can I do if I am in the situation? For these things, if we want to answer these kinds of questions, I think it would be most productive to start with some specific examples, because chances are what you want to do to get yourself out of the situation will depend on all these specificities. Whereas if you want to understand this philosophical problem, which is really very general and abstract, then we should abstract precisely away from all those things that would be so useful and helping. So there's a kind of disconnect that actually you often find in philosophy of value theory, where one kind of inquiry really makes you, and you should ignore history, you should ignore individuality, you should ignore everything that enters into interpersonal, relationships, specific ones. But when you're trying to now figure out how to act in response to those things you've discovered, well, then you should bring it all back in. Yeah.
Very interesting. So, as I understand where you're at with your argument, we should all be thinking about whether our perceptions are reasonable or not. And I guess I want to ask, can we also have a theory about what's required to be reasonable in terms of questioning our perceptions? And what would go into such a theory?
Absolutely. I don't actually take the main upshot of my solution to the problem to be, now we should all go out and question whether our perceptions are reasonable. That's sort of more in the domain of self-improvement or something, which is very important, at least as yourself anything with myself, it's very important. But yeah, what would it be to you're asking what would it be to make your perceptions more reasonable? What does reasonable even mean? I think this is a very good question.
So maybe take the cop example.
Yeah.
I think we'll say there's a case in Cleveland. One sense is that police officer did not consider a sufficient number of alternatives about what he might be seeing when he shot the kid.
That is one possibility. And, these cases, of course, they cry out for, how, they were individual cases, but of course they represented trends, and there was well-known analyses of how policing could be improved. And I actually organized a workshop on this topic called can psychology improve policing? Because I had read a lot of the psychological literature about that, but it came to think, and in fact, in the conference we all came to think
I was
that
there.
you were there. Of course you were there. Okay, sorry, I recognized you from someplace. Okay, so you can tell me what you took it, but I took the upshot of that to be psychology. It's not really exactly the place to look to improve policing. No, I gave you these examples because I think they do. The individual bias is a real thing, and it's in an individual, so it's important, to that extent, to study it. The reasonable person standard concerns our individuals reasonable, so we have to deal with that. But when we look at the problems that are generating the cases, well, it's not at all obvious to me, and I don't think, I felt, you can tell me if you had a different impression, but I felt we actually had much of a consensus, despite the fact that we were from many different fields, sociology, literature people, law people, philosophers, that it wasn't really the kind of problem that would be well solved by trying to get individual officers to adjust their minds.
Was it behavioral based, like cognitive behavioral therapy, or was it psychotherapy, or
Was what?
the kind of psychology?
Oh, I see. Well, in this workshop, we heard from some psychologists who had done experiments on decisions that how police officers make decisions to shoot in certain cases. But that was abstracting away from, they were really just treating the main decision that the police officer had to make as to shoot or not to shoot. So, think of all the other decisions that a police officer has to make in a situation. It's not as if, the sole question is whether or not to shoot. Of course, it's not reasonably asked. Well, it's not a badly formed question, but if that's the only question you ask, it can kind of give the impression that that's the only relevant kind of consideration to make if you're asking how to improve policing.
Right.
I think that's pretty
So I guess I was trying to push the notion of, should a society have some norms? And let me give a parallel example. I play tennis. There's usually some disagreement about whether the ball was in or out.
Right.
Now, one norm should be that if you were closer to the ball, we ought to trust you as opposed to me. And I sometimes have problems with people who are 100 feet away thinking they saw it was right. So we work on having that norm.
Right.
Another norm, though, it sort of supersedes that, is to say, well, after the 6th time you've sung it differently than that person, maybe there is a problem.
Right. You show yourself to be unreliable about that. Yeah.
So one wonders whether, not that it's really so much at the psychology level, but whether police shouldn't be trained to think about sort of what the other possibilities are in terms of their scene, particularly given the prejudices that obviously they're bringing to the situation.
Yeah. It seems like that couldn't hurt, but I don't purport to be an expert in how to improve policing. Thanks a lot.